Top 1, the Hashashin in 1092 CE, near the road between Isfahan and Baghdad. The most powerful administrator in the Seljuk world stopped to receive a petition. Nizam al-Mulk, vizier to Sultan Malik Shah, was the kind of man whose signature could move armies in starved provinces. A figure stepped forward in the crowd, close enough to be mistaken for a devout traveler seeking mercy. In a single motion, a short blade flashed from beneath a robe. The vizier collapsed, and the attacker did not run as guards closed in. Witnesses later described something colder than courage on the assassin's face, a certainty that looked rehearsed. For the Seljuks, the killing felt impossible. Their empire stretched across vast distances. Their intelligence networks were practiced. Their courts were surrounded by swords. Yet a lone stranger had walked through layers of protection, like a document stamped with authority, reached the heart, and ended it in seconds. The shock was not only the death, it was the implication that the fortress was not the walls around the vizier, but the unseen organization that had placed the knife in that moment. That organization was the Nizari Ismailis, centered at Alamut, a mountain stronghold seized in 1090 CE under the leadership of Hassan Asaba. Alamut was not a city, it was a control point perched on a high ridge in the Alborz Mountains, reachable only by narrow paths that could be defended by a small number of men. From that stone spine, the network expanded outward, not as a conventional army, but as a disciplined system of influence, infiltration, and targeted violence. In later European retellings, they became myth. In the political reality of the medieval Middle East, they were a strategic weapon. Their method was designed to defeat empires that relied on scale. Instead of battles, they used proximity. Operatives were placed under disguises that could survive scrutiny. Servants in household kitchens, scribes in administrative offices, traders moving between towns, students in religious circles. The goal was not a quick strike from a distance. It was patience measured in seasons and years. The attack itself tended to be intimate, often with a dagger at close range, sometimes in a public place where denial was difficult and fear spread faster than any messenger. Contemporary chronicles suggest that the killings were meant to be read as messages. A single death could redirect policy, fracture alliances, or force a governor to live behind locked doors, suspicious of every cup offered and every visitor admitted. The power of Alamut was not the number of blades. It was the way a blade could make an empire behave as if surrounded. Legends later claimed narcotics and mind control. The historical record supports something simpler and more disturbing. Ideological discipline, compartmentalized cells, and a chain of obedience built on belief and training. Empires tried to respond with the tools they understood. Garrisons were reinforced. Travel was restricted. Accusations spread. Yet the more defenses tightened, the more daily life became a field of paranoia. If an assassin could wait inside a household, the household became a prison. If a trusted clerk could be an infiltrator, paperwork became a threat. The organization survived because it did not stand in one place where an empire could crush it. It was rooted in fortresses, but it operated through people. The end came only when the Mongol advance reached the Iranian plateau. In 1256 CE, Hulagu Khan's forces took Alamut, dismantling the physical heart of the network. Even then, the system did not vanish overnight. Other strongholds held out for years, and scattered remnants continued to resist until the last fortresses were reduced and isolated. The timeline matters because it shows the scale of the problem. A group without a conventional army endured across generations, outlasting multiple rulers, surviving shifting alliances, and forcing world powers to spend decades learning how to hunt something that refused to stand still. If Alamut was not defeated by law, nor by ideology, nor by ordinary military pressure, but only by an overwhelming external invasion, then the question left behind is uncomfortable. How many other structures of power have existed and still exist that cannot be dismantled by strength alone because they are not built like states in the first place? Top 10. The Ottoman Bostansi Corps. In 1622 CE, Sultan Osman II was overthrown and later killed during a period of intense unrest within the Ottoman Empire. While the Janissaries are often cited as the primary force behind the coup, Less attention is given to the inner mechanisms that enabled the removal of high-ranking officials within the imperial court. For centuries, the Ottoman state maintained a specialized corps known as the Bostancia, originally tasked with palace security and guarding the imperial gardens along the Bosporus. Over time, their responsibilities expanded into something more discreet and more consequential. The Bostancia were not mercenaries. They were salaried servants of the Sultan, recruited through rigorous selection processes and trained within the palace system. Their duties included guarding gates, controlling access to royal quarters, and overseeing sensitive internal affairs. Among these responsibilities was the execution of officials who had fallen out of favor. The method was typically strangulation with a silk cord, a practice chosen to avoid shedding royal blood and to preserve ceremonial dignity. Unlike public executions intended as warnings, these removals were often conducted quietly. A grand vizier summoned to the palace might enter expecting consultation and never leave. Records would note dismissal or death without detailing circumstances. Because the Bostancia operated under direct imperial authority, their actions were shielded by institutional legitimacy. There was no need for clandestine escape. The system itself concealed the operation. Training emphasized loyalty above all else. Many members were drawn from the Devshirme system or other channels that fostered direct dependence on the Sultan. Advancement within the corps required demonstrated discipline and discretion. Knowledge of specific assignments was tightly restricted. Orders were transmitted vertically, limiting the risk of coordinated resistance. Even within the palace, few outside the highest ranks knew when a decision had been made to eliminate an official. The endurance of the Bostancia corps across multiple sultans illustrates a different variation of the assassination guild concept. Unlike oppositional networks such as the Hashashin or decentralized cells like the Bagodai, the Bostancia represented internalized coercive power. The state did not merely fear infiltration. It institutionalized selective elimination as a governance tool. Attempts to challenge or reform such a system faced structural resistance. The Ottoman court relied on balance between factions. When a grand vizier accumulated excessive influence, removal served as a corrective measure. Because the Bostancia acted under sovereign command, accountability was absorbed into the person of the Sultan. There was no external body to investigate or prosecute. Over centuries, the corps adapted to political changes. While their prominence fluctuated, the principle remained consistent. A designated group within the palace possessed authority to carry out lethal decisions discreetly. This continuity survived dynastic transitions, internal revolts, and administrative reforms. By the 19th century, modernization efforts and institutional restructuring reduced the traditional role of such corps. Yet the legacy persisted as an example of how states formalized mechanisms that elsewhere appear conspiratorial. What differentiates a secret assassination guild from an execution corps may be less about method and more about authorization. If a ruler can maintain a permanent body trained for selective elimination within the heart of governance, then the boundary between justice and expediency becomes ambiguous. The Bostancia did not operate against the empire. They operated as an extension of it, and that may represent the most enduring form of organized assassination. Not rebellion in the shadows, but power exercised behind closed doors, protected by the architecture of the state itself. These ancient assassination structures reveal a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Across Persia, Judea, Egypt, Japan, India, Gaul, the Deccan, and the Ottoman court, organized systems of targeted elimination emerged, endured, and adapted. They were not isolated criminals. They were structured networks with recruitment pipelines, compartmentalized command, and operational discipline that often survived longer than the regimes they challenged or served. Some operated against empires. Others operated within them. Yet the architecture remained strikingly similar: distributed cells or tightly controlled corps. Loyalty reinforced through ideology, bloodline, or institutional dependence. Communication shielded by codes, oral transmission, or vertical secrecy. When one operative fell, the system persisted. When one fortress was destroyed, fragments survived elsewhere. The ability to endure did not rely on numbers. It relied on design. Authorities responded with military force, purges, intelligence campaigns, and legal decrees. In some cases, overwhelming invasion dismantled physical strongholds. In others, infiltration from within fractured cohesion. But rarely were these organizations erased quickly. More often, they faded gradually, absorbed into state structures or dissolving into communities where documentation thinned. The broader implication extends beyond the medieval world. Whenever power concentrates, mechanisms for discrete removal tend to follow, sometimes formalized, as with the Bostonsha, sometimes oppositional, as with the Hashashin or Sikari. The historical record shows that systems built around secrecy and compartmentalization are inherently resistant to conventional suppression. They exploit trust, proximity, and institutional blind spots. The question is not whether ancient assassination guilds existed. The documentation confirms they did in various forms. The deeper question is whether such structural models truly disappear, or whether they evolve, adapting to new political architectures while retaining the same core principles of concealment and selective force. If power has always been negotiated not only in courts and battlefields, but in shadows maintained by design, then history's visible narrative may represent only part of the machinery that shaped it. If these accounts of hidden blades and invisible networks have changed the way you perceive the history of power, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury. Plant the seeds of the future with us. The next treasure of the past will be revealed soon. Top 2. The Sicarii. In 66 CE, during a crowded festival in Jerusalem, a Roman official collapsed without warning. Witnesses described a brief disturbance, a shout swallowed by the noise of the market, and then blood spreading through linen robes. The killer was never seized. Those nearby felt only the press of bodies and the sudden realization that someone had vanished into them. The weapon was small, easily concealed. The act lasted seconds. The fear lingered for years. Roman administrators in Judea were accustomed to unrest, protests, tax revolts, sectarian disputes. What they were not prepared for was a disciplined network that did not fight in open fields, but struck inside their own security perimeters. The group, later identified as the Sicarii, took its name from the Sika, a short curved dagger that could be hidden beneath a cloak and drawn with minimal motion. The design allowed an operative to step close under the pretext of conversation or devotion and deliver a fatal wound before anyone understood what had happened. The strength of the Sicarii did not lie in numbers. It lay in structure. Ancient historian Flavius Josephus described them as extremists, but beneath the label was something more organized than a mob. They operated in cells. Targets were selected for symbolic value. Roman officials, collaborators, local elites perceived as aligned with occupation. The killings were public by design, staged in marketplaces or during religious gatherings, where anonymity was guaranteed by density. A single operative could move within a crowd of thousands and disappear in the same direction as everyone else. Training emphasized proximity and discipline. The dagger had to be placed precisely between ribs or beneath the sternum to ensure death before guards reacted. Escape was not always required. In some cases, the operative blended seamlessly back into civilian space. In others, arrest was accepted as part of a broader message. The point was not survival of the individual. It was survival of the network's reputation. If every official suspected the man standing beside him in prayer, then authority became fragile. Roman responses followed predictable patterns. Patrols increased. Public executions were staged to deter dissent. Informants were cultivated, yet the Sicarii did not present a central headquarters to raid. They were embedded within the very population Rome sought to govern. Each arrest revealed little beyond the individual. The structure above remained obscured by compartmentalization. Knowledge was divided. Orders traveled quietly, likely through trusted intermediaries who did not expose the full chain. As tensions escalated into the First Jewish-Roman War, the Sicarii's activities merged with broader revolt. They seized fortifications, including Masada, and turned them into defensive strongholds. But their earlier urban operations had already demonstrated the core principle: assassination as psychological warfare. The blade was not merely a weapon, it was a signal that occupation carried invisible risks. When Masada fell in 73 CE, after a prolonged Roman siege, the Sicarii as a visible force disappeared from the record. Rome crushed the rebellion with overwhelming force. Yet the operational model had already proven itself. A small, ideologically driven network, using concealment and public proximity, had destabilized imperial confidence for nearly a decade. The Roman military machine could defeat legions in open battle. It struggled against a structure that did not declare itself. If the Sicarii were remembered by Rome as fanatics, it was perhaps easier than acknowledging the deeper vulnerability they exposed. An empire built on roads, fortresses, and surveillance can still be penetrated by a blade measured in inches. The lesson was not about the size of the weapon. It was about the difficulty of dismantling a system that hides in plain sight, structured just enough to coordinate, but dispersed enough to survive. Top 3. The Fatimid Intelligence Network. In 1021 CE, Cairo woke to the news that its caliph, al-Hakim, bi-Amr Allah, had vanished during a night ride outside the city. His donkey returned alone. His garments were later found, cut and blood-stained, but his body was never recovered. Rumors spread immediately through the streets and corridors of power. Some whispered divine ascension. Others suspected conspiracy within the palace itself. What remained undeniable was this: the heart of the Fatimid state had been penetrated from within. The Fatimid Caliphate ruled from Cairo with a sophisticated administrative system and an intricate court hierarchy. Access to the ruler was controlled by layers of chamberlains, guards, scribes, eunuchs, and trusted advisors. On paper, the structure appeared impenetrable, yet multiple episodes across the dynasty's history reveal a pattern of internal removals, sudden disappearances, and quiet eliminations that did not resemble spontaneous rebellion. They resembled coordination. Chroniclers described factions operating behind ceremonial formality. Loyalists positioned within the palace were not merely servants. They were strategically placed observers. Young recruits could enter service in their early teens, assigned to kitchens, stables, or clerical roles. Over decades, some rose through ranks, gaining proximity to decision-makers. Their value lay not in speed but in endurance. The palace was not stormed. It was absorbed from within. Unlike battlefield assassinations, these operations required restraint. Poison, controlled access, and manipulation of information were more practical than open blades. A cup of sherbet delivered by a familiar hand carried less suspicion than a dagger in a crowded hall. If a ruler or high official fell ill and died within days, official records could attribute the cause to fever or divine will. In a court culture that guarded prestige carefully, public acknowledgement of assassination threatened legitimacy. Silence became the preferred response. The Fatimid court was also a center of religious and intellectual authority. Networks tied to Ismaili doctrine extended beyond Cairo, reaching across North Africa and into the Levant. Allegiance was ideological as well as political. This created the possibility of covert loyalty structures overlapping with official bureaucracy. An operative did not need to act alone. He needed only to trust that orders, transmitted quietly through religious channels, carried strategic intent. When caliphs were replaced abruptly or viziers executed without transparent trials, historians recorded the outcomes, but often lacked clear evidence of mechanisms. The absence of detail itself is revealing. In a system obsessed with ceremony, why were some transitions so poorly documented? The most plausible explanation is not chaos, but controlled erasure. Records could be amended. Witnesses could be reassigned. Narratives could be adjusted to preserve continuity. This pattern of internal infiltration prefigured later organizations that refined the model. The concept was simple: embed loyal agents inside the administrative core of power, allow time to grant credibility, then act at moments of vulnerability. Unlike insurgent groups operating outside city walls, palace infiltrators benefited from the state's own resources. Food, shelter, access, and information were provided by the very institution they might one day destabilize. Attempts to counter such networks were inherently difficult. Purges risked eliminating loyal officials alongside suspected conspirators, weakening governance. Excessive suspicion paralyzed administration. Yet inaction invited further penetration. The Fatimid state endured for nearly 2 centuries, but internal fractures accumulated. By the time the dynasty fell in 1171 CE, external pressures combined with internal instability had eroded its resilience. If an empire's greatest threat can originate from servants standing within arm's reach of its ruler, then fortresses and armies are secondary defenses. The real battleground becomes trust itself. And once trust is compromised, dismantling an invisible network hidden behind loyalty oaths may prove more complex than defeating any army at the gates. Top 4. The Iga Shinobi. In 1579 CE, Oda Nobunaga launched a military campaign into the mountainous province of Iga. The objective appeared straightforward: subdue a relatively small territory resisting central authority. Nobunaga commanded tens of thousands of soldiers, armored samurai, arquebusiers trained in coordinated volleys, and logistical support drawn from expanding domains. On paper, the result should have been immediate. Instead, the invasion stalled. Scouts vanished. Night attacks disrupted formations. Fires ignited inside secured encampments without warning. The terrain itself seemed to reject occupation. Igai was not a conventional province. It functioned as a loose confederation of local families who had cultivated a distinct martial specialization over generations. These were shinobi, later romanicized as ninja, but in contemporary records, they were practical operatives trained in reconnaissance, infiltration, sabotage, and targeted elimination. Their strength was not theatrical invisibility. It was structure. Villages coordinated intelligence. Knowledge was inherited through family lines. Techniques were refined across decades rather than invented for a single war. Training emphasized endurance, adaptability, and psychological discipline. Recruits learned to move through forested slopes silently, to scale fortifications using rope and iron claws, to navigate at night using minimal light. They studied disguise, regional dialects, and social cues, enabling them to blend into merchant caravans or religious pilgrimages. Physical conditioning was paired with information gathering. A shinobi who survived had to know not only how to strike, but when not to. Unlike centralized armies, the Iga Confederation operated without a single exposed headquarters. Authority was distributed among influential families. This decentralized design limited the damage of capture. If one cell was compromised, the broader network endured. Communication relied on trusted messengers and prearranged signals rather than written orders that could be intercepted. The absence of rigid hierarchy made them difficult to map and therefore difficult to dismantle. When Nobunaga's first campaign faltered, it revealed a strategic imbalance. Conventional forces relied on visible engagement. The shinobi targeted supply lines, isolated commanders, and exploited narrow mountain passes. Even when casualties were limited, the uncertainty imposed disproportionate psychological strain. Soldiers forced to guard against unseen intruders lost sleep and discipline. The environment became an adversary. In 1581 CE, Nobunaga returned with overwhelming force and superior planning. Iga was eventually subdued through scale and coordinated assault. Many shinobi were killed. Others were absorbed into service by rival lords, including Tokugawa Ieyasu, who recognized the value of their expertise. The Confederation as an independent entity diminished, yet its practitioners did not vanish. They integrated into state intelligence structures, carrying forward methods refined in resistance. The persistence of Iga's operational culture across centuries suggests that its survival was not accidental. It was built on intergenerational continuity. Skills were taught within households. Alliances were reinforced by marriage and shared risk. Loyalty was not to a distant sovereign, but to a network bound by geography and mutual dependence. This foundation allowed the Confederation to endure repeated pressures before being overwhelmed only by concentrated military expansion. What made Iga formidable was not mythic stealth. It was systemic design, a distributed intelligence apparatus rooted in community, capable of acting offensively yet disappearing defensively. Empires measure power in territory and troop counts. The Iga model measured power in information and mobility. If a confederation of rural families could challenge one of the most ambitious unifiers in Japanese history, forcing adaptation and respect, then the equation of strength becomes unstable. Victory over such a structure required more than battlefield dominance. It required re-engineering the political landscape around it. And even then, fragments survived, carried quietly into the service of the very state that once tried to erase them. Top 5. The Koga Shinobi. In the mid-16th century, as rival warlords maneuvered across central Japan, a regional daimyo in Omi province reportedly fell ill. Without warning, his condition deteriorated within days. No open assault had breached his residence. No army had approached his lands. The cause was recorded as sudden sickness, a common explanation in an era before modern medicine. Yet among competing clans, suspicion did not settle on disease. It settled on proximity. South of Iga, in the neighboring region of Koga, families had cultivated a parallel tradition of covert operations for centuries. Unlike the confederated resistance model of Iga, the Koga lineages functioned through tightly guarded family systems. Knowledge passed from parent to child, uncle to nephew, often encoded in oral instruction and secret scrolls preserved within households. Their structure resembled a web rather than a hierarchy, each strand anchored by blood ties. Historical documents from the Sengoku period reference Koga operatives serving various lords as scouts, saboteurs, and occasionally assassins. What distinguished them was their adaptability. Where Iga shinobi often operated collectively, Koga practitioners were known for integrating individually into rival domains. A retainer in one castle might, in fact, trace lineage to a Koga house. Years of service built trust. Access followed naturally. Training began early. Children were conditioned physically through climbing and endurance exercises suited to the rugged terrain of the region. Equally emphasized were social skills. Mastery of etiquette allowed an operative to navigate court settings without raising suspicion. Understanding dialects and regional customs reduced the risk of exposure. The goal was not spectacle. It was invisibility achieved through normalcy. Techniques attributed to Koga sources included the use of subtle toxins derived from plants and minerals, though documentation remains fragmentary. More consistently recorded is their expertise in intelligence gathering. Mapping routes, cataloging guard rotations, and relaying information across domains provided strategic advantages disproportionate to their numbers. An assassination, when it occurred, was often the final step in a chain of preparation that could span months. Attempts to eradicate Koga networks encountered a structural problem. Because authority was familial and decentralized, eliminating one household did not dismantle the wider system. Surviving branches absorbed displaced members. Moreover, many daimyo relied on their skills even while fearing them. Employment offered control, but also dependency. A lord who dismissed such operatives risked empowering a rival willing to hire them. As Japan moved toward unification under Tokugawa Ieyasu in the early 17th century, the overt need for freelance covert networks diminished. Stability required centralized intelligence. Some Koga families entered official service. Others receded into rural life, preserving traditions privately. The absence of dramatic confrontation in historical records does not indicate insignificance. It reflects the effectiveness of concealment. The Koga model illustrates a variation on the assassination guild concept. Rather than occupying a fortified stronghold, they embedded themselves in social fabric. Rather than declare ideological opposition, they offered skills to whoever held authority. Longevity was achieved through flexibility. Survival depended on never appearing as a unified threat, even while maintaining internal cohesion. If sudden deaths of regional leaders were recorded as illness, and if intelligence flowed invisibly across political boundaries, then the visible history of the Sengoku era may represent only part of the operational reality. Beneath alliances and betrayals documented in chronicles, smaller currents move with precision. The question remains whether those currents were isolated to their time, or whether similar family-based networks have quietly adapted to new structures of power in the subsequent centuries. Top 6. The Thuggee Brotherhood in 1812. Along a dusty trade route stretching between Kanpur and Jhansi, a caravan of merchants vanished. There were no burned wagons, no scattered cargo, no bodies left for scavengers. Families waited weeks for news that never arrived. Local authorities recorded the loss as banditry, a routine hazard on long overland journeys across the Indian subcontinent. But some British officers stationed in the region began to notice a pattern that did not fit ordinary robbery. Travelers often disappeared after joining seemingly friendly groups along the road. Strangers who shared food, stories, and protection from highway thieves. These companions would walk together for days, sometimes weeks, building familiarity. Then, at a moment chosen with precision, the victim would be separated under a pretext. A length of cloth, known as a rumel, would be looped around the neck and tightened in one coordinated motion. Death was silent and efficient. The body was buried in a pre-selected pit, often prepared in advance. The caravan moved on as if nothing had occurred. Those identified by British investigators as thuggee were not a loose collection of criminals. Testimonies gathered in the early 19th century describe structured roles within each killing team. One individual distracted the victim, another delivered the strangulation, a third ensured the body was concealed. Leaders, sometimes called jemadars, directed operations and maintained discipline. Signals were conveyed through coded phrases embedded in casual conversation, allowing coordination without arousing suspicion. The network's longevity was striking. Accounts suggest operations stretching back centuries, embedded within the constant movement of trade across northern and central India. The thuggee blended into pilgrimage groups and commercial caravans, exploiting the trust required for long-distance travel. They did not attack fortified cities or confront armed escorts directly. Instead, they targeted isolation points along the route, where disappearance could be attributed to wilderness hazards. British colonial records, particularly those compiled under William Henry Sleeman in the 1830s, document an extensive campaign to dismantle the network. Sleeman's approach did not rely solely on patrols. It focused on intelligence. Captured members were persuaded to provide detailed confessions and identify accomplices. A system of informants penetrated the organization from within. This method proved more effective than conventional policing because it mirrored the structure it sought to expose. Debate persists among historians regarding the scale of thuggee operations. Some colonial accounts estimate hundreds of thousands, even millions of victims across generations. Modern scholarship questions the highest figures, suggesting exaggeration may have served administrative narratives. What remains consistent is the existence of a coordinated system of ritualized killing, sustained over decades, if not longer, before systematic suppression took hold. The endurance of the thuggee model relied on mobility and compartmentalization. Teams operated independently, connected by shared practice and belief rather than centralized headquarters. Allegiance was reinforced by oath and, according to some testimonies, by religious devotion associated with the goddess Kali. Whether spiritual elements were central or peripheral, they contributed to cohesion and justification. By the mid-19th century, sustained colonial surveillance and prosecution fractured the network. Many were imprisoned or executed. Others faded into rural anonymity. The official campaign declared success, yet the underlying lesson was clear. A structured organization could operate across vast territories without visible fortresses or banners, sustained by secrecy, trust, manipulation, and predictable human behavior. If caravans could be infiltrated repeatedly without raising coordinated alarm, it suggests that the greatest vulnerability in any system is not its defenses, but its assumptions. Travelers assumed companionship meant safety. Authorities assumed disappearances were random. The thuggee exploited both. And once a network learns to operate inside expectation itself, dismantling it requires more than force. It requires redefining what is considered normal. Top 7. The Bagaudae Shadow Cells. In the late 3rd century CE, across the rural provinces of Gaul, Roman tax collectors began disappearing. Some were found dead along forest roads. Others simply never arrived at their assigned destinations. Small administrative outposts reported sudden attacks, carried out at night by groups that dissolved before reinforcements could mobilize. Rome described the perpetrators with a single term, bagaudae. The word implied brigands, rebels, lawless peasants. The label simplified what the empire struggled to categorize. The bagaudae were not a standing army confronting Rome in open battle. They emerged during periods of economic strain, heavy taxation, and weakened central control. Composed largely of local farmers, deserters, and displaced villagers, they formed decentralized bands operating across Gaul and parts of Hispania. Their targets were rarely random. They focused on imperial representatives, landowners aligned with Roman authority, and supply caravans sustaining military presence. Unlike organized legions with banners and command structures, Bagodai cells functioned with fluid leadership. Authority likely shifted based on local trust and situational need. This lack of centralized command frustrated Roman suppression efforts. Eliminating one band did not dismantle the phenomenon. Another could emerge miles away, drawing from the same pool of grievance and local familiarity with terrain. Their advantage lay in geography and integration. Rural Gaul was dense with forests, rivers, and scattered settlements. Members of the Bagaudae blended seamlessly into the agrarian population. By day, they appeared as laborers. By night, they could assemble quickly, execute targeted violence, and disperse before imperial patrols arrived. Information flowed through community ties rather than written correspondence. This made interception nearly impossible. Roman sources often depict the Bagaudae as chaotic insurgents, yet the persistence of their activities across generations suggests more than spontaneous revolt. Inscriptions and legal decrees from the late Roman period reference repeated campaigns against them. The need for ongoing suppression indicates continuity. While not an assassination guild in the strict ceremonial sense, their operations shared core elements with covert networks: compartmentalization, local recruitment, and precise targeting of officials. By the 5th century, as Roman authority in Western Europe eroded under external invasions and internal fragmentation, Bagaudae groups appear again in records. Some historians argue they aligned opportunistically with incoming powers. Others suggest they represented localized autonomy movements rather than ideologically unified resistance. What remains consistent is their ability to survive beyond individual crackdowns. Rome's response relied on military expeditions and punitive measures. Entire communities were subjected to collective punishment when suspected of harboring rebels. Yet such measures risked deepening resentment and fueling further recruitment. Suppression addressed symptoms without resolving structural instability. The Bagaudae thrived in the gaps between imperial reach and rural reality. Unlike the fortress-based Hashashin or the familial Koga networks, the Bagaudae model depended on social diffusion. It required no central archive, no sacred stronghold. Its continuity stemmed from shared circumstance and adaptable leadership. When one group was destroyed, the conditions that created it persisted. This cyclical resilience complicated any attempt at permanent eradication. If Rome, with its legions and administrative machinery, could not fully extinguish decentralized rural cells over successive decades, it highlights a recurring vulnerability. Large systems are designed to confront defined enemies. They falter against dispersed actors embedded within the population they govern. The Bagaudae were labeled criminals, yet their longevity suggests structural intelligence, even if undocumented. In historical memory, they remain shadowy. Few detailed accounts survive from their perspective. That absence is itself part of the pattern. Organizations that operate without monuments leave minimal trace. They influence outcomes through disruption rather than proclamation. And once official records reduce them to a single dismissive term, the complexity of their structure is obscured. The question that lingers is whether the Bagaudae were an anomaly of a collapsing empire, or an example of a model that reappears whenever authority stretches too far from the communities it claims to control. Top 8. The Persian Fedayeen Corps. In 1126 CE, inside the Great Mosque of Isfahan, a respected religious scholar was approached by a young man who appeared to seek counsel. Witnesses later recalled nothing unusual in the exchange. There was no raised voice, no visible struggle. Then the scholar staggered, a blade driven into his chest at close range. The attacker was seized almost immediately. He did not resist. According to several accounts, he showed neither panic nor regret as he was led away. Across Persian and Levantine chronicles of the 11th and 12th centuries, similar incidents appear with unsettling regularity. High-ranking officials, governors, judges, and rival religious leaders were struck down by individuals willing to die in the act. These operatives were often described as fedayeen, a term implying self-sacrifice. While associated most prominently with the Nizari Ismaili movement, centered at Alamet, the concept of the fedayeen extended beyond a single fortress. It represented a structured core of trained, ideologically committed agents deployed with surgical precision. Recruitment appears to have drawn from communities aligned with specific doctrinal loyalties. Young men were selected not solely for physical ability, but for conviction. Training emphasized discipline, patience, and absolute obedience to hierarchical authority. Unlike mercenaries motivated by pay, the Fedayeen operated under a framework of spiritual duty. This distinction altered the strategic equation. Traditional deterrence relied on fear of death or punishment. For an operative prepared to accept execution as fulfillment of purpose, such deterrence weakened. Operational methods followed a recognizable pattern. Targets were approached in public or semi-public spaces where access was plausible. Disguise played a role, often involving the attire of students, traders, or pilgrims. The weapon of choice was typically a dagger, ensuring close contact and minimal opportunity for escape. The act was meant to be witnessed. It signaled vulnerability within the highest ranks of authority. Authorities responded with increased security and periodic purges. Yet the Fedayeen network functioned through compartmentalization. Orders were transmitted along controlled lines of communication, limiting exposure. Even if an individual operative was captured and interrogated, knowledge of broader strategy was restricted. This structural insulation preserved continuity despite repeated arrests. It is important to distinguish documented history from later embellishment. Medieval European narratives exaggerated aspects of Fedayeen training, attributing their commitment to narcotics or mystical manipulation. Contemporary scholarship finds little evidence supporting such claims. What is substantiated is a disciplined system rooted in ideological cohesion and organizational planning. The power of the network derived not from mythic mind control, but from calculated integration of belief and strategy. The endurance of Fedayeen operations over decades, spanning multiple political regimes and military campaigns, underscores the difficulty of dismantling ideologically structured cells. Unlike transient rebellions, their cohesion was reinforced by shared doctrine. Unlike family-based networks, their loyalty extended beyond bloodlines to a centralized spiritual authority. This created both resilience and vulnerability. When the Mongol invasions of the mid-13th century destroyed key Ismaili strongholds, including Alamut, the institutional backbone fractured. Without territorial anchors and leadership continuity, the core diminished. Yet the model itself did not disappear from historical imagination. The concept of a self-sacrificing operative, trained within a defined ideological hierarchy and deployed strategically against political targets, would resurface in various forms across later centuries. Whether directly inherited or independently reinvented, the structure demonstrated a durable logic. If conventional armies rely on numbers and fortifications, and decentralized cells rely on social diffusion, the Fedayeen model relied on conviction integrated with organization. It reveals another dimension of assassination guilds, the transformation of personal belief into a strategic instrument. And when belief is embedded within a structured command system, dismantling the system requires more than neutralizing individuals. It demands disrupting the narrative that binds them. Top 9. The Maratha Intelligence Network. In 1689 CE, as the Mughal Empire pushed deeper into the Deccan, a senior Maratha commander was captured and executed. The Mughal court believed the resistance would fracture without centralized leadership. Instead, imperial supply caravans began failing to arrive. Messengers disappeared between fortified cities. Isolated officers reported poisoning, ambushes, and sudden desertions within their own auxiliary ranks. The battlefield had shifted, but not in a way visible on maps. The Maratha Confederacy, under leaders such as Shivaji and later successors, developed a decentralized intelligence apparatus that functioned alongside conventional military forces. While not formally branded as an assassination guild, its structure contained the essential components of one: recruitment through trusted networks, compartmentalized cells, strategic targeting, and operational secrecy maintained across decades of conflict. Merchants, pilgrims, and itinerant craftsmen moved fluidly across Mughal-controlled territories. Many of them carried more than goods. They gathered information on troop movements, fortification weaknesses, and internal rivalries among imperial officers. Reports were transmitted through coded language embedded in commercial correspondence or delivered orally through intermediaries trained to memorize without written trace. The network relied heavily on local knowledge of terrain, allowing operatives to exploit mountain passes and forested corridors inaccessible to large armies. When elimination was deemed necessary, methods varied. Poisoning through food or drink was documented in regional accounts, as were carefully orchestrated ambushes disguised as bandit attacks. The objective was not indiscriminate killing, it was disruption. Removing a quartermaster at a critical moment could starve an advancing column. Eliminating a courier carrying strategic orders could delay reinforcement by weeks. Each action appeared isolated. Collectively, they formed a coordinated pressure system. Unlike fortress-based organizations, the Maratha network embedded itself within everyday economic life. Traders and revenue officials interacted constantly with Mughal administrators. This proximity provided access without arousing suspicion. Moreover, loyalty was reinforced not solely by ideology, but by shared regional identity and mutual dependence within the Confederacy. Authority was distributed among local leaders who maintained their own subnetworks, reducing the risk of total collapse if one branch was exposed. Mughal countermeasures included surveillance, interrogation, and attempts to cultivate informants. Yet identifying a coherent enemy proved difficult. The intelligence apparatus did not maintain a visible headquarters to besiege. Its command structure was layered and adaptive. When one operative was compromised, others adjusted routes and methods. The flexibility mirrored the broader Maratha strategy of guerrilla warfare, in which speed and information outweighed numerical superiority. Over time, sustained pressure contributed to Mughal exhaustion in the Deccan. The empire's resources were stretched thin across prolonged campaigns. While large-scale battles determined territorial control, the quieter operations of intelligence and targeted removal eroded administrative stability from within. By the early 18th century, Maratha influence expanded significantly as Mughal authority weakened. It would be inaccurate to portray the Maratha intelligence system as a secret order detached from state power. It functioned in service of emerging political authority. Yet its operational design shared key characteristics with earlier assassination guilds: endurance across generations, reliance on concealment, and strategic use of proximity rather than spectacle. The network's success illustrates a recurring principle. Large empires project power visibly through armies and architecture. Counterstructures undermine them invisibly through information and selective force. When those counterstructures are embedded in daily commerce and local society, dismantling them requires dismantling the very fabric of interaction that sustains governance. If history records the fall of Mughal dominance in terms of battles and treaties, it may overlook the quieter mechanisms that made those outcomes possible. Behind shifting borders lay a system of covert coordination that thrived precisely because it never demanded recognition.